Good afternoon. This is Lee McWhorter, cybersecurity instructor for WazU. Welcome back to the third part of the Security Foundations class that began a couple weeks ago and we'll be wrapping up this Sunday. We've already covered the first 7 lessons. We wrapped up last week talking about PCI DSS, Payment Card Industry's Digital Security Standard, as well as a little bit about some of the other entities. And I said we would, of course, come back to that because this week we have to cover the last 3 lessons, 8, 9, and 10. And 8 is called Security Frameworks 2. So if we explained last week that security frameworks are basically like blueprints or templates that we can use to help construct the cybersecurity policies and procedures, and set up the security policies and procedures, and set up the, repeating myself, set up the posture and create the posture of an organization. As I said last week, the payment card industry standard is what we would want to consider at the bare minimum of what you would need, what that they consider any organization that takes credit cards needs to be compliant and to have, the basic things covered, that they, have accountability, so everybody has a unique login, that they have certain degree of security awareness training, encryption of the sensitive data, things like that. So all of those 12 areas of that are you consider the basics. Then as you look further in lesson 8, we cover a ton. I'm not going to go through every one of them, but I want to hit some of the bigger entities that are covered. As I said, usually security frameworks, these guidelines, these blueprints are provided by different kinds of either regulatory agencies, non-governmental agencies, or industry type groups. And so we have things like the payment card industry, obviously, is an industry type group. But then we have organizations like ISO, usually commonly referred to as the International Standards Organization. You may have run into an ISO thing before, like if you've ever made a copy of a CD, a DVD, and not just a, like ripping your MP3s off, but to make a complete image, that's referred to as an ISO file. And it kind of stems from the fact that they set that standard. So the International Standards Organization creates all kinds of standards for how Wi-Fi works and Bluetooth and all kinds of different technical things and manufacturing things. There's an ISO 9000 standard. It's all about quality. Dell here, which is a big local employer here in Austin, Round Rock area, is an ISO 9000 certified manufacturer, for example. So ISO actually has the 27000 or 27002 particularly, but the 27000 series of documents that are related to cybersecurity. In America, we have the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and much like ISO at the international level, NIST basically provides and promulgates different policies and procedures and guidelines, and as their name implies, standards. So they're the folks that, are involved with deciding what exactly is a second, for example, atomic clocks and things like that, standards of how various things would work out there, whether it be quality standards, whether it be manufacturing standards, safety standards, or in our case, their NIST 6, I'm reading that wrong, 800 series is basically federal document, federal guidelines from NIST on how to be cybersecurity compliant. Obviously, there are other entities in America, like if you happen to be a contractor or a subcontractor or whatever you are, somehow related to the defense industry, then you would have to follow DoD standards, the Department of Defense. There's another group, Corbett. The European equivalent of NIST is ETSI, European Technology Standards Institute, I guess, would be the appropriate breakdown, but sometimes the foreign languages revert things and they're in acronyms. There is also some additional industry ones, ISA and IEC, which are related, and they have various standards. And so, like I talked about last week, what you want to do if you're in a position of either creating a security framework, security policies for an organization from scratch, maybe you go to work for a startup, or more likely you go work for a place, they have a policy, but then some event happens. It could just be every year we do this. Every year we're going to update our policies and make sure we're doing the best things we can to protect our organization. Maybe there's a merger, an acquisition, different things can happen that cause you to reassess at different points in time. And so you would go through a similar process. You might already have an existing stack of documents or a Wikipedia site, internal website that has all this stuff defined. So you want to start there, and you would go through and look at all this stuff. And then you would go once again, even though it's been done before, you would go out and look at all the new, many times, of course, these organizations put out new versions of these standards on different regular basis. Could be annually, could be every few years, could be whenever some significant change happens, and there's a reason they feel they need to update those documents and those guidelines. And so you would go out there and look at all the different ones that might have an impact on your organization. So, okay, you're an American company, you want to look at, but you do business around the world. So ISO is a good place to start. So is the NIST, because you're looking at the standards promulgated by the U.S. organization or agency. But that doesn't mean you stop there. You might want to look at the European standards, particularly something we don't cover as well, as it was still being worked on and finalized as we were designing the program. But last year, the Europeans published what they call their GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations. And these you may have seen about. Matter of fact, last year you probably got a dozen different emails from companies that were telling you they were updating their terms of service. And that's because this was a huge set of privacy and other types of data regulations that are having just a ripple effect around the world, even though they've come from Europe. And this isn't the first time that this sort of the Europeans, especially the EU, the European Union, have been out in front of most of the world, and definitely America, when it comes to propagating standards and regulations related to privacy and data on the internet. And so these rules have impacts around the world, as I was saying. So, for example, the reason so many of us last year got so many of those, hey, our terms are being updated, is because most companies were making the decision that they were looking at the new GDPR standards and going, okay, to be compliant, let's say we're a worldwide e-commerce company or a worldwide social media company, for example, are some good examples. What do I do? How do I address that? So two great examples in the social media world that handle things differently are, one, Twitter. Twitter decided to basically change its terms of service and update its policies and procedures and privacy rules and all this stuff worldwide. And so we all got updates because Twitter was going to basically made the decision to implement and be compliant with the GDPR requirements globally. So even though they obviously are an American company that has people all over the world using their service, they decided that those standards, they have so many European customers, and to stay compliant, it was easier for them just to update their own corporate policies and security policies so that they were compliant around the world. Facebook, on the other hand, did an exactly opposite thing. Facebook decided that, okay, well, here's what we need to do, that we're such a big organization. They're, of course, substantially bigger than Twitter. So that was at least their argument, that they wanted to separate things. So all European customers, as of last year, basically are now managed by Facebook Ireland. So the Ireland office, which is their sort of, you could now say effectively their European headquarters, all of the customers there in Europe are getting privacy standards and settings, and all of that applies because of the GDPR regulations that the EU propagated. But the rest of the world is managed through Facebook US. And so they did not change their standards globally. They changed them to be compliant in one market. So here was one new standard that came out, one new big, not to minimize it, a very big set of regulations from the European Union, but two, comparable, big social media platforms made two different decisions on how to do that. So that's what we're going to be doing for our clients and our organizations that we work for, is if there is a need to go through, which happens periodically for various reasons, as I mentioned, time to go through and update a corporate security policy, or of course with a new company, create one. The idea is we want to take all these different inputs from all these different frameworks and ultimately design a set of policies and procedures and guidelines, et cetera, that we publish internally to our company that are going to be our security posture, going to be our security procedures. And so we're going to use these guidelines and templates to help us so we don't have to start from scratch. So while it's important to have some overview of most of these that are in this lesson, because they might show up on like a certification exam or something, admittedly, some of the more important ones are the ISO and NIST and the European equivalent, but Corbett and the industry ones like ISA and IEC are also they're all important to know because they might show up on security, and they're places you definitely are going to want to look depending upon where you do business, where your organization does business. Even if you, for example, were a U.S. company and you didn't have any business in Europe at all, you still might look because you might get some good ideas or some of the templates and things like that that are provided by that organization. The European organization ETSI, for example, still might be useful to you even if you're not worried about European compliance. But you don't really look at everyone. I mean, every major country has some kind of standards body that's propagating things like this. Um, there are many, many industry groups, and you do have to take into account, and this might lead you to different regulatory agencies, whether that be like the SEC, Department of Education. There are other areas that are particularly, and you might find other industry groups that speak to these too. For example, there's obviously very high regulations in healthcare and banking and education. And so if you're in those industries as part of setting up your security standards, you're going to want to look at the regulatory agencies that speak to you, the laws that speak to you, and any other industry groups that have, once again, they're already faced this problem. They've had to be compliant with whatever law it is, HIPAA, for example, in the healthcare field. And so people have already generated some guidelines and templates you can use. So 7 and 8 go together effectively. We finished up with 7 last time on PCI DSS, and then 8 is a much deeper dive into so there's a plethora. I think there's a chart in that lesson actually that just shows all the different standards bodies, and or maybe it's a link to a page that shows all the different standard bodies, and all over the world. So all the major countries have them. You don't have to look at every one, but you definitely want to look at ones where you do business and where you might be doing business. And some of the better ones are bigger entities, more experienced, longer running such entities. NIST is highly respected, for example. Lots of people all over the world look at NIST guidelines and to set up and follow standards because they want to be compliant with American standards, even if they're not doing business in America. They can just claim they're doing that. Or the same with ISO. We're ISO, like I said, Dell's an ISO 9000 Six Sigma certified kind of manufacturer, and they went through that process. I remember years and years ago, actually, I happened to be in a different form, a different company, different thing, but I was doing private training, corporate training at that time, and helped do some training for Dell around some of those topics and some engineering training to keep them compliant as they went on. So anyway, then lesson 9 is threat actors in detail. So we already talked in one of the very first lessons about threat actors. That's the phrase we use in cybersecurity to refer to anything that can, be a threat to our organization. And in the first lesson, that we focused primarily on the human adversaries out there, from the amateur script kiddies to the highly experienced criminal or nation state players that are up at the advanced persistent threat level, and all the layers in between. And we talked about how, we need to be aware of them. We want to understand them, and because obviously these are the potential threats we face. And so in this lesson, we want to dig a little deeper because it's, some people have said before, it's a little common sense, isn't it? But there are attributes we want to understand, because depending upon who you're facing, potentially as an adversary, or what level of threat actor you're facing, it can impact your rankings from a risk management point of view. It can impact the decisions you make from a security and defense point of view, etc. So like, for example, if we start off with the easiest one, the script kiddies, the folks that are just sort of starting out in the cybersecurity hacking and cracking world, if you will. They may have gotten their first computer for Christmas, as I joked last week or a couple weeks ago, or they got it for their birthday, or they finally got access at school, whatever the case is. And a certain percentage of people, every group, a certain percentage of every new 10,000 computer users, for example, have this inclination to hear. They've heard about hacking, they've heard about things, they have some reason they want to hack a friend's Minecraft server, they want to be able to cheat and knock somebody offline during a multiplayer game. Whatever it is that their motivations are, they'll go out and hit some of the various, hacking sites and malware sites and tool sites, and they will download things so that they can begin to experiment and play. And then many times, the reason we call them script kiddies is, regardless of their age, is because they're just at that kind of, newbie level. They're using off-the-shelf tools. They're using things other people have written. And so their expertise is very minimal. Their resources are also very minimal. And then we get a lot of automatic stuff from that. They're just going to run a tool. The tool is going to come and try to, probe your defenses or check for vulnerabilities or try to pound away on a password when they find, try to log into something remotely, a brute force kind of attack. And so they'll do these things, but they're almost, because of their sheer inexperience, they're not customized. They're very standard attacks. They are looking for what I like to refer to as the low-hanging fruit. And sadly, there's plenty of it out there. So, almost every wannabe hacker is going to, if they spend any significant amount of time trying to do some of these things, sadly, they're going to be successful, because somebody's going to bring up a server and not change default passwords, or bring up a device. I shouldn't just say server. Bring up something on the internet. It could be an Internet of Things device, like a new smartphone, camera, smart fridge, whatever. They're going to bring up something they spin up in the cloud, and they don't do the basic things they need to do to set a good password, to disable certain services or whatever. And so then when a crop of, some script kiddie out there, guy, girl, young, old, whoever, just somebody starting out in this space starts to run their tools, they're going to get a lot of failures. But then boom, hey, what do you know? They managed to break into they're on some machine. They now have access to it. And what they do with that kind of varies. So, as I always tell people in our program and in other places where I teach and talk cybersecurity, if we do the basic things, we can eliminate almost that whole class of threat. Because if we just do the basics, we change default passwords, we have good password policy, we have a layered defense, all these things we're just learning in this beginning class, then we can eliminate that. It happens all day, every day, to all the servers I manage. They're constantly under attack. But the vast majority of that traffic is automatic stuff, and a good chunk of that is from amateurs. Maybe they have taken over their first few machines, and then they're using those machines to continue to spread and try to attack and look for other low-hanging fruit. Sometimes it might literally be, and I had one of these not too long ago, where it traced back to some place that was pretty identifiable. But these are amateurs. But even as you climb into the next tiers of sort of people who start to move over to the dark side, not just experimentally, but truly become the lowest rung of the criminal hackers out there, well, they've gotten through. They didn't get caught in their script kiddie phase. They may have learned a few tricks along the way, right? So they're getting a little better. And if they have had success in the past, which is likely, sadly, then now they have some resources. Now they have some additional resources they can use, whether that's places they can store their malware, to put links in. They've taken over somebody's WordPress site and they've hit a bunch of malware up there, and now they can send a bunch of spam out, and those links will go to those, basically stolen storage resources, or they will embed, something into a server that they've taken over, or they're using it directly. They're using it to propagate their next attacks. These are, the things we need to take into mind. Once again, at this lowest level still of even the early hackers and hacker wannabes and young early criminal, I shouldn't say young, but starting out criminal hackers, once again, they're not much better than the script kiddies, really. They're doing a lot of, they may have gotten better, they may have tuned their searches so it's not just random to anybody in the world, that they're kind of targeting a certain niche, but they're still using a lot of standardized kind of tools. So we can block these, we can look for these signatures, we can look for this type of probing and activity and be able to respond to it if we, once again, set up our defense as well and have a good layered defense approach. As we continue to graduate up, though, and people get better and better, then of course they have more and more skill. They are beginning to customize tools, and they have definitely more resources. And as a matter of fact, we begin to see criminals come together, and ultimately, just like in the real world, not the gray economy or the dark economy, underground economy, but the real economy, somebody might start out a business, then they meet some other people, they partner, they do a joint venture, they form a new company, they move on. This is the kind of stuff that happens every day, all day in the real world. Well, truly, it happens every day, all day in the underground economy too. So, somebody who's been off and they've gotten pretty good, maybe they can send some spam, they've taken over a bunch of machines or accounts or whatever, and they're being able to send spam out. It doesn't really cost them anything because they're using other people's resources, but they're starting to make a little money. Now we have money, we have some skill, I have some resources. And then you put a few of these together because somebody says, hey, I see, maybe they meet on the dark web, maybe they meet someplace else, some other forum, talking, asking for advice, and then you end up bringing somebody who's gotten better than just using the stock malware. Maybe they're customizing things a bit. You got somebody who's a little better than just the basic take over some accounts and send spam. They've actually compromised some mail servers, and they're able to get a better delivery rate. You bring these two people together, and now you have spam that is sending malware, and both of those are more complex. And then, of course, as you continue to move up the chain to the very highest, levels of both the criminal, and you start to get in comparable levels with some of the government entities that have their own attackers and defenders, we have very sophisticated people who may be writing their own custom code, customizing things on a regular basis, um, being whole syndicates, basically. I ran into one years ago and got a client out of it because they had been infected by a Trojan that had opened up a backdoor, installed some monitoring, key logging type software on the system, and then by capturing banking login credentials, were able to steal a fair amount of money from this client. And so was brought in after it had happened and was able to do some malware analysis on the malware to see what it did, who it was trying to talk to, things like that. And do some analysis to make sure it wasn't elsewhere in the company network, and clean everything up, etc. And one of the things that I learned is it was actually how little I learned, because sometimes you find something, somebody gets infected, and you look it up and it's big known. It's, oh, okay, they must have downloaded it from there and they sent it, and this guy clicked the link, and yeah, he got the malware. But this was one where you couldn't find anything about these people. Very little. I found only a little bit through Norton Semantics information. They had seen this threat before and had identified it as an Eastern European syndicate that was highly focused on attacking mid-sized companies around the world. And their kind of modus operandi was not to attack that company directly. They instead would be trying to do some recon and do a little bit of research and maybe attack a secondary company. And that's exactly what happened here. Actually, in this case, it was a nonprofit that was attacked, and not an uncommon model. Their nonprofits often have less resources. Maybe somebody's volunteering a website on the side on their personal server or something, or helping, some tech person helped them set it up years ago, but then it's just ticked along and nobody's maintained it for a while. So there ends up being this likelihood that you can get into a nonprofit. So they would attack nonprofits and then find out, of course, who was on the board, be able to read all the email, and then sort of put things together and ultimately decide their targets from that recon. And in this case, the company in question, one of the senior people there, also was a board member of another nonprofit. And so when they were able to get into that nonprofit and figure that connection out and read email, long story short, is they used a faked email looking like it was coming from that person from the nonprofit address to the finance person. They clicked on the link, they ran the attachment. It wasn't an image or a PDF or whatever it was supposed to be. It was actually like document.pdf space off the screen.exe. And of course, that's actually one of your first signs of trouble, is if you try to do something, you, against your better judgment, you click on a link, you trust an attachment or a document, a PDF, whatever it may be, and you click on it in an email, and it doesn't open up in the expected software. So if it's a PDF, it doesn't come up in Reader. It's a Word document, it doesn't open up, or it's a graphic and it doesn't open up, whatever your picture viewer is, the Windows picture gallery or whatever the photo viewer is. If those things don't happen, which is in this case, the lady in question clicked on it and nothing happened. So she thought, what is he sending me? I'll ask him later when he comes in the office, and just moved on. But that was actually, it ran in the background, installed its backdoor, downloaded the key logging software, and pretty much monitored this finance person's computer for the next few days. And unfortunately for them, in that window, they did log in to a bank account, which those credentials were captured, and the attackers were able to use literally remote control of that machine through the back door and the captured credentials. They even had cookies and stuff, They were able to log back into that bank and start sending money off to prepaid credit cards that accomplices could go pick up. And they were able to get a fair amount of money before it was noticed by the bank. And then I was brought in to help clean it up and shut it all down. And it was really fascinating to learn how sophisticated these folks were, because when I watched the malware, for example, it wasn't like some of this shell starter malware that you can kind of get from the net from somebody else that's already built it and just use it yourself against your own targets. This one was definitely custom built. And I can tell you this, if you had it on your machine, you could have had it and never known it. And in 48 hours, it would have gone away. It totally deleted itself, cleaned itself up completely, pristine. Why? Because they don't want to get caught by the antivirus. They don't want to stay around long enough that potentially a new signature update or a new update to the antivirus, or anything they're doing finally flags the antivirus, and that way they get caught and removed from the system. They want to quietly sit there, look for key things. They're looking for bank logins, but it's more like commercial banks, not like just a personal bank, a little Citibank or something, but like big banks, Citibank, Bank of America, whatever. They're looking for big logins to these big commercial banks. And if they find them, then they know they potentially can use those credentials to steal fairly large sums of money. And then, but if they don't, so if I had gotten it on my machine, 48 hours later, it would have gone away, completely removed itself, because it doesn't want to linger around and get figured out, get analyzed. It was a very smart software. It was very hard to trick it into operating. I literally had to create in a virtual setup, not only infect the machine, because just doing that didn't do anything, and that's where I noticed it went away. It's like, okay, let's try this again. So I even had to set dates back because the stuff was programmed to, this is the version, it's good for so long. And every few days they're putting out a slightly tweaked new version of their malware, and they continue to operate on. So as we move up the sophistication layer, then we realize that if those types of threats are actually targeting you, and as you can see, here's a pretty sophisticated threat, maybe not a state level or absolute top level of the criminal gangs that might go for the big companies, but here was a group, a fairly sophisticated group targeting mid-sized companies and related third-party entities that might be related to them or might allow them a backdoor or a way in, using very sophisticated spear phishing campaigns and fairly sophisticated malware to accomplish their objectives. So it's those types of threats and beyond, if they apply. If you're in the defense industry, banking, certain sectors, high tech, you have to think, yeah, we're going to have it all come at us. The governments of the world are trying to break in and steal our tech, or some governments are. Big criminal gangs are trying to steal the credit card list, user list, all these things that we see, the breaches that show up all the time. And obviously that goes on, but the big entities like that aren't going after a mom and pop pizza place. Others might, but they're usually not that sophisticated, not some nation state player, not the top criminal syndicate, so to speak. But it's all part of understanding. And even if you run into things like some of the other kind of outlier categories, like what's a hacktivist? A hacktivist, somebody who's hacking for a political reason or a cause. I've run into those before. And they can run the gamut from being script kiddies, really, even though they're trying to hack for a cause, so they're really not as much of a threat, to, of course, some that have some degree of sophistication and skill and might know about backdoor no one else, that most other people don't know about. They might know about and use different techniques that are more advanced than just the person starting out. But, whether they have resources, whether they do or don't, kind of varies. Many times not, because how have they gained it? They haven't been a criminal all this time. They decided to take up the hacking cause to it. You can look around the world, any war, any conflict, there's going to be hackers on both sides that are attacking the other side's resources, trying to deface their sites, trying to get their message across, propaganda, etc., and take the other sites down, vice versa. But some of that's at an amateur to mid experience level, and then some of that is, of course, actually kind of a front for some of the others. In some conflicts, you may have what is ostensibly an independent, hacking activist group that really is funded by the government, but just to have whatever government, whatever country in question, so they have some plausible deniability. So it's important to understand the breadth and depth of the threat landscape, because you're going to need to, within your organizations, be able to look at what do we face. We're a small mom and pop, so we're probably not having, whatever big enemy foreign country you want to say, hackers try to attack us. Probably not. So do we have to worry a whole lot about that? Probably not. But we can have some sophisticated criminal attackers that might try to get us, especially if we have anything of value. We have all loyalty programs. So we have a lot of information on our customers. Well, it depends on how many, whether that's a big target or not. But that's all part of it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in our last lesson. But it's what you need to do to, do the risk analysis, do the organizational analysis, do the threat landscape analysis, so that you can decide how you're going to rank the threats, and you're going to respond by allocating resources, and how many layers of your layered defenses are you going to need to protect yourself in most cases from the threats you do face. Now, beyond all this discussion of the threat actor types, again, with more details on their attributes, motivations, resources, money, etc., there is, in my opinion, one of the other things that's maybe even more important to understand and to not forget, and that is the concept of what we call the non-human threat actor. In the case, when people get into cybersecurity, and when people think about cybersecurity, and you even read articles and stuff like that, the vast majority seems to be so focused on the black hat hacker in a hood somewhere, hacking away, stealing money, stealing credit cards, stealing user information. And as we've discussed, these are real threats, and they run the gamut, and we have to be prepared, knowledgeable about them. And if we do the basic things right, we can eliminate a whole segment of that. And then we got to focus on what are the other segments that we might face, and how do we defend against those more sophisticated targets? Threats, actors. But we sometimes in our field get so caught up in defending against the hacker that we forget that our job is broader. And that's, if you remember, if we go back to the first week, the central triad of things, what I call the three promises that we in cybersecurity make to the organizations we protect, are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Availability, I said, don't forget the A back then in the first lesson, right? We can understand confidentiality. We got to keep this data secret, source code secret, customer list secret, employee data. Yep, okay, good. We can understand integrity. We need to make sure this data stays, auditable. When it changes, we know who changed it, we know why. It's not, some kid hacking in and changing his grades, some competitor hacking in and changing values in our books, right? We want to maintain the integrity of that data. But a big part of our job is to maintain the availability of these resources. We're defending them, not just to keep things secret, but we're defending it so that there's no disruptions, because we're there to enable our organizations to succeed. Without success, without getting more donations, without making more sales, without accomplishing the organization's objectives, there will be no tech, and there will be no security jobs to defend said tech and said information. The company will go out of business. And so we don't want that. We want our company to succeed. And so a big part of being aware of the threats, and remember, anything that can disrupt any of those three promises is a threat. So yes, a hacker breaking and stealing data, that's a confidentiality violation. We get that. Brute force login, steal some critical data, login with administrator rights, change something, that's an integrity violation. A denial of service attack that takes us offline so that our website's not available is an availability attack. And if we're making millions an hour through e-commerce, that's costly. And even if we don't make a lot of money directly, it's marketing, it's reputation, it's image, and it's still, not able to do our jobs. So we have to protect availability. And while hackers are definitely something the bad hackers are something we have to be aware of, we also have to be aware of just about everywhere you live in the world. I'm not sure if there is anything we could call a safe place. There is something that could happen to you and your organization. Just before I began this video, we had 60-mile-per-hour straight line winds come through here. I'm actually glad that the power wasn't knocked out or the cable didn't go down today and it didn't impact my workshops. It literally was passing through at about 12:45 my time, right before I started these. If that had gone down, then I wouldn't have been doing this workshop. I'd have had to pull one from the archive of part 3 and post it up for you folks today instead of doing a new one. And this was, in my case, I had a backup plan, right? I could post a backup copy. I could post one I'd done before. So that's the kind of thing we have to be aware of. Weather, natural disasters of any kind, hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, political disasters. You may not, it doesn't happen often in America and definitely not in modern times, but think about what happened. There were terrible Hurricane Katrina came through New Orleans, caused a lot of damage. I used to live in New Orleans, so I remember it. Well, I'll never forget the Google Maps satellite picture of the neighborhood I lived in. I might have been one of those people that you saw the footage of having to cut out of their roofs if I hadn't have left. And generally speaking, though, I didn't ride out hurricanes in New Orleans. I also spent some time in Houston, so I've had my share of hurricanes on the coast, and know they're not something to take lightly. But as a young person, I did ride out. I didn't have much choice as a kid, but we rode out Hurricane Alicia, which came right over Houston years and years ago. I literally got to stand in the eye of a hurricane as it passed over my house. And that was a unique experience. But in retrospect, I wish we had gone further north instead of staying just in the Houston area, and didn't do that while I lived in New Orleans. But if I had, my house was in one of those lower areas. I had a 2-story duplex, and only the roof was visible. I mean, there was so much water, but I could tell because I could look out my window and see up the levee that wasn't too far away in that neighborhood. So when the water came in, it came up to that level. So, and that not only was that a huge hurricane, natural disaster, but because it had such an impact on society, we saw a breakdown. We saw a breakdown, not just of power being out for a few days and houses being destroyed, but weeks of destruction and lawlessness and not being able to operate. So if you were a business and a security person in New Orleans during that time, I'm sure almost all of them were pulling their hair out. Companies couldn't get back up. And so if you were based there, but you didn't have any other facility somewhere else, if all of your stuff was there in that area, you had no external backups. You had no planning to have a hot site or a cold site or some kind of, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but further off, you were dead in the water. And possibly, and it did happen, a lot of companies did not come back from that event, both the hurricane and the aftermath of the hurricane. Those were like a 1-2 punch that caused, so many people to move away and never come back. And thus that so much loss of economic activity caused so many companies to fail. And in many cases, it was a failure of their IT security teams to plan for that natural disaster and those occurrences. If you have a manufacturing or facility, you work, you're an international company, you have all kinds of faith. What happens if a civil war breaks out in a country you're doing business in and it's a critical part of your operation? What if, or a critical source of revenue for your organization? What if, riots break out? Anything that insurance companies like to glorified call acts of God, things that aren't controllable, completely random kind of event. We have to take those into account in cybersecurity. Those are what we call non-human threat actors. And it's very critically important that we plan for them. Now, if you live in Des Moines, Iowa, and that's where your business is and your work is, and there's plenty of good companies there and plenty of cybersecurity people doing this kind of work, they're not really worrying about a hurricane. Um, they're just not. It's not going to make it that far inland, right? By sheer definition. And they're not, maybe, even though technically they can happen everywhere, they're probably not as worried about even an earthquake. They're in the core of the United States on sort of old continental crust. Very rare to have earthquakes there, but that doesn't mean they couldn't have floods, blizzards, polar vortexes now, they seem to be being called in the last few years. These really nasty storms. We used to call them blue northerns when I was a kid. They did these storms that come down and really bring down basically, Arctic kind of weather all the way into deep into the country. And they're used to a lot more snow and stuff in Des Moines than we are down here in Texas. But if they get twice the amount in 24 hours than they're used to, or they get 10 times the amount, what do? They might be able to, they could even be overwhelmed. And we see things like, airlines closing and transport being shut down. And if enough, snow is falling and ice and things like that are forming, take down power lines, all kinds of disruption, which could once again keep you from doing your job unless you have the good plans in place. So that leads into our last lesson, which I'm going to try to use our last time here to efficiently. And that's the lesson 10 on organizational security. Basically, we've kind of learned what security is, what our job is, what our 3 promises are, different things about the threat actors, different things about different kinds of attacks. We've learned how we don't have to do this all on our own, that we can, that we're going to use a combination of people, products, and procedures. So to create those procedures, we are going to use all we've learned now about these security frameworks to use them as blueprints and guidelines to develop the policy. But how do we do that? What makes us decide X versus Y in that process? I want to go with this template or that template. I want to have this level of strength in my security layer, or I want to have this many layers. Where do we decide those things? How do we decide those things? Well, we have to go through the process of doing an analysis of our organization. Now, anything we do, any of the things we've talked about, promulgating a password policy, putting in place firewalls and intrusion detections and layered defenses, putting cameras, locks on doors, badges, biometrics, whatever, all those things we call in this field are controls. So we're putting a control in place. And there's all kinds of controls. I'm not going to talk about that. I do recommend you get that down kind of in your head, but there's things like preventative controls. There's really kind of a couple ways that controls can be classified. And you might see that as like an exam type of question. If nothing else, it's good to know because you're going to want to know what kind of controls, and you'll see this reference. There might be a list of possible controls or different controls that could be applied. But password policy is a control. In one classification scheme, it would be what we call a preventative control. We're trying to prevent somebody from getting unauthorized access. So we have a password policy that ensures that you pick a good password. And that's one of the things we're doing to help make sure nobody gets in that shouldn't. It's also what we would call, if you look at it under a different classification scheme, not the timing of when it impacts, but what type it is, then you could say that's an administrative control. Okay, because it's a piece of paper that says your password must be changed every 30 days. It has to have so much length and complexity and whatever the rule. That's the administrative control. It's a document. You may have had to sign it as part of being onboarded through the HR process. Okay, so anything we do to try to prevent, and try to protect our network, we call them controls. But how do we decide which controls and which types we're going to use? Well, we're going to use a whole bunch, not just one or two, right? We got a layered defense. We got so many different things. A firewall is a technical control. All right. It's also attempting to be preventative, and intrusion detection is more of a detective type control. All right. Oh, we see something got passed and we're reacting to that. We're throwing an alert. So, but how do we decide these things? Well, the way we decide it is within our security team, within our senior management, etc. We're going to have to do an analysis of our own company, our own organization. We're going to have to basically look at the risks we face And if you remember from earlier, a risk is when a threat and a vulnerability come together. So if you have a website and potential vulnerable software within that infrastructure, the OS, the firewall, the backend software, the web server software itself, all of those have been known to have vulnerabilities before, will again. And so if you have a website, technically you might have, especially if it's a 0 day, nobody knows about it yet. But there could be vulnerabilities on those systems. And we do know now that there are various levels of, from inexperienced all the way to experienced players out there, threat actors who are attempting to take advantage of web vulnerabilities or take advantage of weak passwords or take advantage of misconfigured setups, whatever it may be. So if you have that come together of a risk, a threat, and a vulnerability, that becomes a risk. So we have a web server. We know there's web hackers out there. We have a risk. We have this system, and we know people could do this. We have a risk. We have Wi-Fi, so we have this risk. And so you have to do a risk analysis and see what risks your organization faces. What industries are they in? What kind of things do you have that you need to protect? Is it your source code? Is it customer list? Is it credit card information? What is it? And then, of course, the various frameworks will help us with their suggestions. And then our process of going through and analyzing those risks will help us decide which and what number and type of controls we need to put into place. And the reason we do risk management, and a lot of what we do in cybersecurity is about risk management, is we're identifying risk. We are then either qualitatively or quantitatively ranking those risks. And a qualitative risk assessment is just saying, ooh, that's a high risk. Oh, that's a low risk. That's a medium risk. You just put a classification on it. A quantitative analysis is do the math. And that's really what you have to do. Okay, so, and I always use the example, it's kind of silly, but it's simple. You got two companies, they both got a website. We know there's lots of web hackers out there, so they both face a website risk. Now, this company is Amazon, and this company is Lee's Pizza. Amazon makes a gazillion dollars a day or so many dollars a second while their site is up, right? All day, every day, chunking out money. Lee's Pizza has a map to my store, my menu, my phone number, stuff like that. So I don't make a dime from it, except I do indirectly. Now, we would obviously just gut say Amazon faces a much higher risk as a qualitative risk of web attack than Lee's Pizza does. That's a true assessment, but that doesn't tell us much. And that didn't help us figure out exactly how much money Amazon or Lee's Pizza is going to spend to defend their website. So in the case of Amazon or most companies, you would do a qualitative analysis and you'd be looking at like, okay, I'm just making easy numbers up here. This is not Amazon, but I make whatever, $100 million a day on the web. I make $1 million a minute, whatever it is, second, minute, hour, it doesn't matter. You quantify it. And then we know how much it would cost us to be down for a minute, a second, an hour, a day. So if I'm making $1 million a day, now I'm probably not going to spend $1 million, but I might, especially if I don't think my average downtime is that long. We look at all those things, we quantify it all. But if somebody takes down my server and I'm making $1 million a day, then that's a lot of money, right? So I would be willing to spend a fair amount of money to defend this website and keep it from going down, because if it does and I'm down for 2-3 days, that could be the end of my business. Lee's Pizza, on the other hand, a few people every day. I get a few hundred visitors. Some of them are bots. A few are real people around lunch or dinner time looking for a restaurant. Google has helped them find me because they're near me. They live near me. They drove near me. And then they look and say, hey, look, Lee's Pizza's over here around the corner. It looks like I got reasonable prices. Let's go. So I get some customers. I'd have to make some kind of analysis of that. Like I have 100 website hits every day, but I get 2 new people I don't recognize walking in my door. And maybe one of those comes from the web. The other just found me, luckily, right? So I make $20 from my website, whatever the average order is, and I know, so if I attribute only 1 visitor a day coming because of my website, I am not going to spend $1 million. I'm not going to spend $1,000 to defend that site. It's 3 pages, a home page, a menu, and a contacts page. I'm going to keep a backup of that site. And if somebody takes it down and defaces it and puts up their Guy Fawkes mask or their anti-whatever political cause, or they just try to steal, try to break in because they want to use it, then I'm going to reset that server and set my sage and change my passwords and maybe call my hosting provider and find out what happened, but I'm not going to do a lot, right? But Amazon is going to have a whole security team, a dozen people trying to defend that kind of situation, or that $1 million a day company would. And so that's a big part of what we do is this whole risk management approach is we look at everything. And as I've said in the beginning of this class, as you go through this program, and even as you finish this class, I'm hoping that we're already beginning to internalize these basic concepts. That's the point, because what you want to do is carry them forward not only through the rest of the courses, but through your whole career. When you look at something, you need to look at it from the point of view of those basic things like CIA, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. When you read an article about a breach, you should know what kind of breach it is. It wasn't just a breach. It was an integrity breach. It was an availability breach. It was more likely, as a common, with these breaches of millions of records, it's a confidentiality breach. You want to look at situations. You walk into a company and look, you see post-it notes hanging on the monitor at the front register, the reception or registration desk. You see a violation. You see what you shouldn't be doing, right? And you learn these things. And you look at what is the risk. Now, maybe in their case, they figured, we don't know all the details. Maybe that little reception machine, while the machine has a login just to get into that Windows, it in of itself is isolated and can't do anything unless you log in again to their mainframe system or their cloud-based management system. So in a sense, if somebody sees that password, gets into that machine, that they don't have the better password, the one that's needed to get onto the corporate backend, maybe that's not as much of a risk. So they did their analysis. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time trying to protect this stupid little Windows box that's really just a dumb terminal up here on the front desk. We just have to make sure that the individual people who log into the cloud corporate administrative system to do whatever it is, booking reservations, billing, customer service, etc., that's secure. So we have a lot of turnover in this job, and so instead of having to always change the password, and plus we have a day shift, a night shift, and people are using, it's a shared computer, so we're going to let it be shared. Now, I still wouldn't recommend sticking the damn password on it, but nonetheless, you see my point. But that's the kind of thing. I'll go look at something. I may be even able to figure out some more of it by glancing over a shoulder, watching what they're doing while they're entering my order or whatever the case is. And so you want to, I can look at an organization and fairly quickly, just high level, I can look at it physically. I can look at it as a digital, like their website, and tell you what risk they face. And I can do a kind of a qualitative risk assessment in my head. And then if I'm given the numbers, I can help do a quantitative risk assessment. So when we do these risk assessments, they help us decide how much we're going to spend and how we're going to defend our network, how deep our layers are going to be, how many different controls we're going to put into place. Once again, being guided by experience, being guided by our knowledge of what's out there, and being guided by these frameworks that are themselves guidelines and templates. The last couple concepts that are covered are very important. They fit in once again to this whole idea of availability. We get so focused on let's stop the hacker, and that's good, and that's important. If the hacker gets in and totally encrypts an entire set of servers, then okay, the same thing applies. But many times they apply not so much from those types of breaches, but because of the non-human threat actors. And that is the idea of what we call business continuity planning. Is a big part of what we do in cybersecurity. We are responsible because we've done all this analysis. We know the risk the company face. We've helped drive budgets and all these other things. And one of the things that we have to drive is how are we going to continue if something does happen, if some incident does happen. And for that matter, there's a subset of just incident response. What are we going to do when anything happens on our network? We have a breach. We should have an incident team be able to respond to that. We have a more major breach, and servers encrypted, lots of access, not just, somebody poked in with SQL injection and managed to read a little bit of stuff from a non-critical database. Oh my gosh, somebody got onto a server and got root. Somebody got malware across our network. Depending on the level of the incident, we're going to have to respond to that. So we'll set up what's called incident response teams and have an incident response plan for those. But as part of that whole process, it's all part of business continuity, because you don't get a virus and just leave it there. You go fix it. You have to restore data from backup. You have to do, well, how do you do those things? Where's the backup? Where was it? Well, somebody had to plan for that because of these analysis and deciding, okay, well, it's actually, for example, the threat that's been pretty big the last couple of years, crypto viruses, where they encrypt everything and then want you to pay them Bitcoin or something. One of the, you can obviously train your people not to click on any links, and assuming they don't, that helps. That can avoid it. You can, in many cases, you can, set up scanning and filtering and firewalls and all kinds of things, and hopefully that'll help remove a lot of it. But if ultimately somebody on your network makes a mistake and they click that virus, and particularly if somebody with any degree of access, and it then spreads across your network and encrypts half your computers, that's a problem. You could basically, for all practical purposes, in many cases, these viruses, these crypto malware infestations, if that happens to you, you're going to be down just like that building burned down. You can't use those machines. You're not able to function. So what's your business continuity plan? What is your disaster recovery plan? What do you do? If it's in the server room or in the cloud, do you have a backup? Do you have a server facility someplace else that you've rented that you can easily bring stuff up in? There's both warm and hot, and so both cold, warm, and hot versions of those. So you can have a hot site means that you have everything ready to go, and you almost flip a switch, and that can come up. A warm site may have, some of the basic stuff, but you need to restore data to it so it's up to date and things like that, and still bring some things online. And then cold site's just a place. It's a place that has, cabling and wiring, and you can bring in equipment, but you don't have anything set up yet. So, of course, obviously, if you have a cold site as your only backup plan, then it may take you a few days to get back up and running. Is that acceptable to your organization or not? If you are making $1 million an hour, you don't want to take 2 days to get your website back up, right? If you are making like Lee's Pizza, $20 a day, then if it takes a day or two to get your website back up, it probably doesn't break your business. And so this whole process of organizational security is about doing a risk assessment and letting it help dictate which way we go, what layers of defenses, what kinds of defenses, what our policies and procedures are. And then a big part of that process is to plan for when things happen. So when an incident happens, we have an incident response plan, maybe incident response teams, depending on severity. If a disaster happens, then we need to have a plan to deal with that, whether that's a crypto virus across the entire organization or a hurricane knocked down our data center. So that is wrapping up lesson 10. Remember, I have one-on-ones with, I think maybe both of the current students in this course and some others tonight. I also have 2 more workshops to knock out right after these 2, this one. So it'll be a little later this evening, afternoon when I get them all posted. Remember, everything's due on Sunday. This group is doing really good, so keep at it. And I'll expect to see you finishing up by this Sunday. A due date tonight and a due date Sunday. And we'll finish up, and we'll see you folks in system administration next week. No, Network Foundations next week. I'm about to do the other one. Sorry. See you next week.